Tina Koto, welcome everyone. Welcome to our guest, presenter, client, webinar attendants, and any media who is joining today in our webinar. Should I stay or should I go now? Why communication is so critical component in the disaster prevention. Thanks again for joining us. It's been a wonderful evening. While we are waiting for everyone to join, please tell us which continent are you from. You may find a pop poll on your right or on the bottom of the screen so that we understand which are the continents you are joining from. Thanks again. With the global sharing of the data and sophisticated satellite systems that can flush messages around the world in a second, why are early warning systems still so challenging? In this session, we are going to explore that answer and what does it mean and what we can learn from the COVID-19 situation. The reality is that information is only useful if we understand what does it mean and we know what to do when we received it. Even the most sophisticated models and advanced early warning system in place, the world will be rendered ineffective if the information is not communicated clearly and timely, and the recipient don't know what to do or what action they can actually take once they received it. The same could be applied in terms of pandemic. The ability to successfully communicate hazard forecast to the communities and stakeholders who are likely to be affected is very critical. Different governments responded. The current pandemic shows us that how critical and how complex the situation is. And in this webinar, we'll be discussing what we have learned from this COVID-19 and how we can actually communicate better for our future to reduce harms. So let's get this show run on the road. Tonkin and Taylor, in partnership with CoData, IRDR, and ISC, brought together 4 specialists today, including our former New Zealand Prime Minister, Helen Clark, and former head of UNDP, who is currently co-chairing the World Health Organization independent review into the handling of COVID-19, as well as responded by the government worldwide. Thank you, Helen, for joining us.
Thank you.
We have Laurie Girardet, the UNDRR Chief of the Asia and the Pacific Office from Bangkok. Thanks again, Laurie, for joining us. And we have Lisa Robinson, Head of Advisory, BBC Media Action, joining us from UK. Thanks again for joining us so early in the morning, Lisa. And we'll be concluding with me sharing some learning around communicating with communities as part of my work on designing multi-hazard early warning systems and my roles in Tonkin and Taylor, CoData, and IRDR. Let's begin by acknowledging what an enormous privilege for us today to have Helen Clark take her time of her incredibly busy life to join us here. Thanks again, Helen, for joining us. Helen is our keynote speaker today and will begin by sharing the key findings of her independent review into the pandemic response. Good evening, Helen. Over to you.
Good evening, and we're actually at quite an early stage with this review panel. The panel was asked for by the World Health Assembly, which is the world's health ministers meeting each May, this year, of course, virtually, as the pandemic was running away. And what the health ministers asked for was this independent, impartial, and comprehensive review of the internationally coordinated response to COVID-19 by the WHO. Of course, to review the response, we also will want to take a look at how countries in general responded as the pandemic unfolded. We see our task as being one of truth-telling, not of blame casting. The key issue is what can we learn from this catastrophe, which has impacted so badly on not only human health and well-being, but on global economies and has implications for global peace and security. So what could have been done better is very much in the focus of the panel, and we will be aiming to make practical recommendations for the international system, which can be implemented. There's no point making pie in the sky recommendations. We need to be very concrete. So without sort of foreshadowing what the panel itself might want to say to the health ministers meeting again in May next year, let me say from a little bit from my perspective, having watched this disaster unfold over the last 9.5 months. The first point I'd make is that we've clearly learned that many countries were not well prepared to cope with the threat of a pandemic caused by a novel coronavirus. It's very interesting to me that the previous rankings of the Global Health Security Index compiled at Johns Hopkins proved to be really way out of the ballpark as to who was prepared for a pandemic and who wasn't. And let me just run through a couple of the numbers here. The 2019 Johns Hopkins Global Health Security Index placed the United States of America as number one and the most prepared to deal with a pandemic. They placed the United Kingdom number 2, Sweden number 7, Brazil 22nd, Mexico 28th, my country, New Zealand, at 35th. I defy anyone to say that any of those countries has responded better than New Zealand, which is seen to have had one of the best rates of response in the world. And a lot of it is down to communication and to listening, but I shall come to that in a moment. And also make the point that an effective response is not just about having the good luck to be a set of remote islands with a very large moat around them. And our moat is 1,000 miles to Tonga, 1,100 to New Caledonia, and 1,200 to Australia. Actually, you have to make your luck, as New Zealand has done. With its early travel bans going back to the beginning of February, and then a block entirely on entry to New Zealand, except by citizens and permanent residents in mid-late March, followed by quite a strict lockdown to get systems in place for containing the pandemic, and now a continuing strict quarantine on arrivals who still, with few exceptions, are only New Zealand citizens and green card holders. Now, the second lesson I'd note is that with a novel coronavirus like this, governments needed very agile and flexible responses and pandemic plans. And those who stuck to the plans they had for flu pandemic, I think, ran into trouble. This is not a flu pandemic. I think the critical thing in the New Zealand response in early March was to throw out the flu pandemic plan as not relevant and begin to devise on the run a bespoke response, which aimed at a zero tolerance strategy wherever the virus emerged, and you did everything you could to stop it emerging, you stamped it out. And that will continue to be the approach taken. But of course, getting an effective response is not just about ex cathedra statements from leaders. It is very much about whether you can take people with you in what needs to be done. And that comes to the issue of communication. And that is an area where I think a number of the women leaders around the world have excelled. In fact, where responses have been good with this pandemic, women have been seen to be leading a number of them. How have they done that? I think they've done it by being seen to put the health and well-being of their citizens at the top of their agenda, whether we're talking Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, the 4 of the 5 Scandinavian prime ministers who are female, Angela Merkel, the president of Taiwan. There's been a high level of empathy and putting health security first. And health security first on the basis that a bungled public health response will lead to deeper and more protracted economic damage from the pandemic. But then, having determined to put health security first, I think these women leaders and men who adopted a similar approach all were seen to take on board the best scientific and public health advice there was. And let's face it, everyone has been running to find out what this was about. This is a disease that was only notified to WHO at the end of December last year. We knew nothing, really, when we started. So communicate what you know, and communicate it clearly. No obfuscation, total transparency, admit to what you don't know, but then set out the basis on which you're taking particular measures and the basis on which you want the public to engage with and follow those measures. Now, it also helps, of course, where there is, in general, a trust in systems of government and public administration. And, the small Western democracies have that in bucket loads. Many countries don't have populations which have trust in their government, and often for quite good reason. And that makes responses harder. And it can also be observed that with some of the more authoritarian regimes, the lockdowns called on the basis of COVID have also been used for purposes of repression. And that further raises levels of public distrust in government and less inclination, except where there's outright fear, to comply with measures. But in countries like mine, the population went along with really quite extraordinary controls on movement in order to try to beat this disease. And that could not have been done without the openness and the clarity of communication and the clear good intention of government being seen to protect the health security of the people. Where leaders haven't been prepared to listen to good scientific and public health advice, where they've tried to say, the key issue here is the economy, frankly, the results for people and their health have not been nice at all, and death rates have been far too high. So I think looking to the future in quite general terms, clearly every country, to safeguard the development progress it has, and I use that term for countries of high income right through, needs risk-informed planning. We used to say at UNDP when I was there, if it's not risk-informed, it's not sustainable development. You see the gains of years now being wiped away by our global and national level lack of preparedness for a pandemic like this. So we need to be prepared. We need pandemic plans. These plans need to be flexible. They need to be agile. Learning from this, we must keep in place very good testing and tracing systems, for which technology is our friend. The innovation that's coming out of the COVID experience is quite extraordinary, with the way in which we test for infectious diseases, and of course our ability to trace people and movement for a positive purpose. And Bluetooth technology, when widely applied, will be particularly helpful for that. I think as part of our planning, we need to keep the tools of public health that have worked on tap to be pulled out whenever required. Those do include mask wearing. Those do include social distancing measures as well. We need to keep always a readiness for managed isolation and quarantine procedures, so that we don't have to scramble to invent them from anew the next time this happens. I think another lesson learned is that where there is not universal health coverage, there is also barrier to an effective response. Where you have people who are marginalised, whether they're undocumented workers or the poor in general or the uninsured, you will struggle to get a good response because people are left behind. And when you're facing a pandemic threat, you can't leave anyone behind, because a risk to one is a risk to all. So coming out of this pandemic, we should redouble our calls for universal health coverage. We also need, as part of the pandemic preparedness plans, to plan for social protection. It's very, very tough in lockdowns where people lose their jobs and livelihoods. Without social protection, enormous damage is done. We need continuity, business continuity systems for our schooling. A lot of children have missed out on a lot of schooling this year. We need support for our businesses, because seeing businesses go over a cliff for no fault of their own is highly problematic. And above all, we must use the periods of lockdowns to get systems in place, not just keep on with endless lockdown because we haven't figured out how to do things any better. So there's a lot of learning that comes out of this. The full report of our panel will have a great deal more to say, but I hope that those reflections from me at the outset have been useful.
Thank you so much, Helen. You're listening, former New Zealand Prime Minister and the former head of UNDP. Thanks again for your speech. Now, we'd like to invite Laurie Giberte, the UNDRR Chief for Asia and the Pacific Office. She'll be talking us on the risk communication is the key to ensure our early warning systems into early action, as well as how the Sendai framework fit into that. Welcome to Laurie.
Well, thank you very much. And let me start off by thanking Ms. Helen Clark for that excellent review of how the COVID pandemic has been responded to and the lessons that are being drawn from the response. I'm really glad to be speaking on the issue of risk communication because we know that risk communication has played a pivotal role on how well countries have been able to respond to the pandemic. I'm also glad because I might note that today is International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, and it's perhaps never more so important than it is now to really emphasize the work that needs to happen to prevent disasters such as COVID from occurring. If you examine any of the past disasters of the last decades, you will see that risk communication has been pivotal in reducing the loss of life and of livelihoods. And even if we leave aside COVID, I think we can point to the fact that the world is facing more disasters of a greater intensity. Just today, my organization released a report that states that the number of major disaster events fueled by natural hazards has doubled in the last 20 years. We recorded over 7,300 major disasters between the year 2000 and 2019, compared to just over 4,000 in the years between 1980 and 1999. Now, we know that climate change is fueling these disasters, and yet there is still so much more that countries need to do to scale up their disaster risk reduction efforts, and that includes improving risk communication. The good news, though, is that while the economic cost of disasters has been increasing, the global disaster-related mortality has been trending downwards, and this is in a large part thanks to better and improved early warning systems. Now, one of the key roles of my organization, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, is to promote the implementation of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which serves as a roadmap on how countries can reduce disaster losses. And I might just mention that the Sendai framework actually includes pandemics and biological hazards, although we have recently carried out a review of the national strategies throughout Asia Pacific on disaster risk reduction and found that very few of them actually took into account pandemics. They have been largely focused on natural hazards. So that's an area of work that we're going to need to work on in the region. But in any case, one of the 7 targets of the Sendai framework calls for countries to substantially increase the availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems. And one of the key features of the Sendai framework is that it aims to put people at the center of everything it advocates for. And when it comes to early warning systems, there's a big emphasis that's placed on the need to make these people centered. Now, what does that mean to be people-centered? I think at one time there was a sense that early warning systems were linear models, whereby scientific agencies communicated information to targeted communities who would then act on that information. And today we know that early warning systems are much more complex than that. Their complexity stems from the fact that they are working in different economic, political, and social contexts. And we also know that they're complex because communication is complex. It is multifaceted, multidimensional, multidisciplinary. And it is not simply a question of one-way information flows from experts to target audiences. Today, related to COVID, we often hear the phrase, we need to listen to the scientists. And I couldn't agree more. We must listen to the scientists. But we know that risk communication is not as simple as that. And one of the key things that we need to remember is that risk communication is a process. It's not a product. And what needs to happen before a disaster strikes can be as important as the information that's shared during the crisis. The pre-event factors influence how people will react to the crisis situation when it occurs and what resources they will have available to protect themselves. You need to connect emotionally with the community and its values before a crisis occurs. A two-way relationship needs to be established. And we know that people view risk through very individual and unique lenses. Their socio-demographics, the resources available, their disability, all these other factors influence an individual's understanding of risk and the choices that he or she makes when confronted with risk. Authorities, they need to better understand their audiences, and this cannot be done at the time when a cyclone is barreling coastal or when a pandemic is. There must be much more investment in risk communication before emergencies strike. And I'm not quite sure that this is actually happening unless we need it to happen. And yet we know that risk communication can be a powerful weapon in the quest to save lives from disasters. If we look at Bangladesh, for example, and the Bola cyclone of 1970, in which over 300,000 people were killed. If we compare that to a cyclone of an even further, a greater, I would say, strength, Cyclone Cedar in 2007, we see that only 3,500 people killed. Now, of course, that number is still too much and it's tragic, but it's just 1% of the lives that were lost in 1970. Cyclone Bola was unprecedented in terms of mortality, yet it steered the country into action, and it resulted in Bangladesh's Cyclone Preparedness program, whose motto is bridging the last meter of communication, not just the last mile. And for those that are not familiar with the program, it was established in 1972 as a joint program of the government of Bangladesh and the Red Crescent Society. And why I mention it is because it features a large network of around 56,000 volunteers reach people where they are before disasters strike. They do house-to-house engagements. They hold events to help people understand their risks. So this is a success story as we've seen by the latter disasters that Bangladesh has faced. But we have other examples where, unfortunately, risk communication was not. If you look at the Indonesian city of Palu, which was struck by a tsunami in 2018, you will.
We are having some difficulties.
I will try to speak slower.
Or maybe just turn your video off.
Okay. Yep. Does this help at all?
Yep. Please go ahead.
Let me try to speak a bit slower and hope that that will help. I think that but with other disasters where risk communication has contributed to
your voice is still breaking, Laurie.
And if I give the example of Indonesia's tsunami in 2008, Palu, where the tsunami. Continue.
Sorry, we are not able to hear you anymore, Laurie. Probably we can carry on with Lisa, and then we can come back again with Laurie for finishing touch in the question and answer session. Thanks again, Laurie. Somehow the connection just disrupted. We have Lisa Robinson from Head of Advisory, BBC Media Action. Lisa will be talking about how to improve the way we communicate about risk in order to prompt action. Lisa, to you.
Hi. I couldn't agree more with much of what Laurie said. I'm sorry that we couldn't hear the rest of that. As an outsider to the field of disaster risk reduction, it sometimes surprises me that the whole field is about foresight and planning, yet the communication element often comes in at the tail end rather than right from the beginning. We assume that as long as we have early warning systems that can beam the right information at the right time to people like this at the edge of the cliff, that somehow they'll take the right action, whatever that is. This is important, of course, and we need to get that right. But as Laurie said, there's so much more than that. We really need a strong enabling environment for those early warning systems to function properly. Be it a cyclone or COVID-19, we know that we humans are very, very complex, and we can find lots of reasons to disregard perfectly sound advice or information based on cognitive biases. So as Laurie pointed out, a quote from a NOAA report on behavior change, communication and risk, that risk communication is a process. It's not a product. So if it's long-term and ongoing, we need to really think about that constantly alongside everything else that we do around disaster risk reduction. So if it is a process, how can we get that process right? What do we need to do? First of all, we need to deeply understand people. We need to understand what they think, feel, and do in relation to risk. We need to understand what would make it easier for them to take action around risk. We need to understand who they trust and how they consume media, especially in very quickly changing and crowded media landscapes. We need to understand both demographics and psychographics. So if we look at the men in the corner here, my left, they might share very similar demographics, age, income, education, but their psychographics might be very different. So one of them might feel that wearing a mask is a sign of weakness. Another might be perfectly comfortable wearing a mask, and he might even choose a red mask to match his red trousers and shoes. So our communication needs to reflect that and speak to people where they are with the issue. We also need to understand what people really care about in life and anchor our communication to those things. I mean, typically for most people, it's going to be around something related to family, to fitting in, to finances, to fun, and to fundamental beliefs. In Bangladesh, BBC Media Action did some research and found that people who were facing seasonal cyclones already knew what they needed to do in order to prepare for those, but they weren't taking action because they didn't want to be the first ones in their community to do something a bit different than everyone else. We also found a case where a family did actually take action to tie their roof down to the foundation of the house ahead of a storm, and then were later accused of witchcraft because their roof didn't blow off while everyone else's did. So fitting in is actually a very powerful driver for taking action or not taking action. In response to that, Media Action launched a national television program role modeling people taking action together in response to community risks. And we did that quite intentionally to address that factor of fitting in. People who watched the program, our impact research showed around 50% of them took action after watching that program. But that program was not so effective just because it was around risk reduction. It's because it was really good television. And people are busy. this fellow here, once he finally has a chance to sit down, what do you think he's going to do? Is he going to read a report about how he should flood-proof his home, or is he just going to switch on the television? If he does switch on the television and he happens to land on one of these shows here, he would have gotten some content related to disaster risk reduction in different ways. And all of these programs address disaster risk, not from an information perspective, it was there, but also they address some of the more complicated drivers around risk and risk reduction. So if we want to mainstream the concept of disaster risk reduction and normalize taking action to reduce risk, we need to weave it into people's everyday lives, whether that's through everyday media or other conversations. Next slide. All right, so it's not just about telling people what to do or encouraging them to take actions. We also need to recognize that there are some very vulnerable people out there who I think really we shouldn't burden them with lists of things that they should be doing. Sometimes they've got impossible choices to make, and very often they're in these situations because of structural issues that are putting them in harm's way. So it's very important that we hold open, inclusive conversations about uncertainty, trade-offs, responsibilities, and this is it's a critical but often overlooked part of risk communication. It's recognized in risk, but we don't always hold those open conversations about it. And these can be really difficult conversations, especially if we're dealing with systemic issues around gender, ethnicity, class, but we have to have those conversations if we really want to make a change. Okay, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that the media doesn't always get it right. It can be really frustrating to deal with the media if they're getting the information wrong, or it's absent, or it's somehow distorting risk perceptions. We all have a role to play here. The media, the technical experts, we can all get better at this. And I think that if we work more closely together, we'll get more accurate information out there. We'll get it out there in a way that people can understand and relate to. And together, I think we can make a stronger, safer. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for your talk. Now I'd like to just share on the last bit of the presentation. As you can see that the goal of an end-to-end early warning system is to make sure that we can actually prevent the hazard to become a disaster. And when talking about the risk communication, the two fundamental elements of an end-to-end early warning system is quite interlinked. One is the dissemination of and notification systems, and another one, what we just listened from other speaker, that the community connection and response is quite important. And warning provider may often ensure that dissemination has been sent from their office, but often they are not quite making sure that there is a proper notification system. So dissemination makes sure that it physically goes, but a notification means that how we actually understand and how actually respond based on the information that we received. Think about a day in your life when actually you receive a warning but unable to make a decision to what to do, or you may be able to prompt response quickly once you receive the information. Give a thought why you did or why you didn't. We'll come back in a minute to talk about that. Now, as I said, that two components, the dissemination as well as the community preparedness, and when information flows from national warning center to the community, there are various layers of government systems, so national, provincial, state, or district, as well as local. And it often actually scattered the information when it goes one layer to another, and we need to make sure that we have a robust information dissemination system so that it makes sure the people who are actually living in the risk area, they actually receive those information on time. And we always try to emphasize that a warning system needs to be set up with a rapid onset disaster like tsunami, so that other slow onset disaster can be easily captured. This is some of the example that we developed for Fiji, Tonga and Samoa and some of the Caribbean islands and Southeast Asia, that how we can actually ensure a robust dissemination and notification systems in place. But again, when you go for a risk communication systems, we often see that, as Lisa already mentioned, that community engagement is quite important. And you may have quite good, robust risk assessment based on your science and evidence. And then based on that, you can prepare a quite well risk governance systems, which is your policy. Here in New Zealand, we have a quite good governance system in place probably. But there are also some other elements that risk awareness, risk perception, and risk interpretation is quite important. And if you don't actually link up those things, our whole system is quite vulnerable. An example here we just shown here that as in New Zealand, we have a quite good risk assessment in place. We have a good risk governance systems, but our risk perception and risk awareness in one of the small community, or the lack of uncertainty and trust, makes quite vulnerable to the whole community. So we need to look at all the systems integrated and work together. So that's one of the things that need to be worked on. Finally, it is well researched that before deciding any disruptive or expensive action, such as evacuation, people must understand the forecast, they need to believe on it, and most important, that they need to feel that they or their loved one are in at risk. However, common practice has been to prepare and release forecast message without adequate understanding how they received it, how they should understand it, and how actually they interpret it. Thus, risk communication process design need to be considered all these three elements. So one is your infrastructure or communication platform. Then you need to make sure that your engagement is right and you actually engage everyone, talk to everyone. And then finally, you apply all your granular risk element so that you make sure that risk awareness, risk governance, risk perception, trust, and builds and interpretation are in place. So that will enable us to making sure that we have a proper risk treatment in place with a proper risk communication. With these things, I'd like to thank you everyone and ask for a question and answer session. But before that, if Laurie, do you like to finish your last 1 minute bit that you'd like to conclude while we are taking some question from the audience?
I hope it's better now. Is it, Beppo? The sound? Yep. Look, what I was just saying was that we had seen situations where risk communication wasn't as effective as it needed to be. And I had given the example, I was just in the midst of giving the example of Indonesia. But we can also turn to Typhoon Haiyan, Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines, in which risk information had been given to the community, but it had been given in a manner which wasn't comprehensible to them. They were not able to understand what a storm surge was or the magnitude of the threat. We learn lessons after each disaster, and our job is to share those lessons so that we can improve. And we do see improvements. For example, after Typhoon Haiyan, we now see a push towards impact-based forecasting, where national meteorological agencies no longer simply produce accurate forecasts, they actually anticipate the likely human and economic impact, and they transmit actionable information. So it makes it easier for communities to act on these. Another area where I think we are learning, and we still have a lot more to learn, is around the role of social media and risk communication. Now, the proliferation of social media can deliver more timely and detailed information than ever before. Young people are more likely to receive information from social media than from traditional media. And it can allow people to confirm risk messaging and to collaborate with each other on assessing that risk. But at the same time, there are some real challenges. As we have seen with COVID, for example, incorrect information that is spreading rapidly. And I think one of the lessons we've learned is the importance of counterbalancing information that people are receiving that is false. And for example, during the 2011 floods in Queensland, Australia, the police adopted a Mythbuster hashtag to respond to rumors. And WHO today is actively seeking to dispel rumors around COVID. They're tracking down the sources of misinformation. So I think that's another lesson that we're learning, and we still have a lot to learn about how to use social media and different types of media that are out there. I started my intervention today just talking about the COVID pandemic. Undoubtedly, this will provide tremendous lessons for us in the future. But one thing that we can always be sure of is that perhaps the most critical element of risk communication is trust. And when you ask people to drop everything and run, they have to trust you. They won't run if they don't trust the source of the message. Sometimes they will not even put on a mask if they don't trust the source of the information. And what we have seen, unfortunately, happen around COVID is that the risk communication has become polarized, it's become partisan, it's become political. And when that happens, it will take a tremendous amount of work to restore trust in communication channels. Building trust takes time and effort, but without this investment, early warning systems and disaster risk management simply will not succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. We have a question from Andrew Tapper. Impact-based communication is a game changer, but it requires a shift to conversing with the community in order to understand their exposure. Are we any good at listening? Anybody like to answer, Helen or Lisa or Laurie? Well, I would say yes, please, Helen.
Well, I think listening is incredibly important by leaders in these situations, like the ones that we're facing right now with the pandemic, because you have to have an open ear to what people's concerns and fears are, and you won't effectively communicate to people in the state that they're in unless you're actually hearing what they're saying. So they have many, many questions. They need open and honest and transparent answers to those, and you will be a better communicator if you do that listening.
Probably one more question here on what should you do about fake news? Probably goes to Lisa.
That's right.
About the infodemic.
Yeah.
The infodemic is a problem. And again, it raises all these issues we're aware of with social media platforms, which have really not been prepared to take a lot of responsibility for what content is on their platforms, trying to pass the buck back to the content provider. I think populations and governments are getting a bit sick of that, and if the social media platforms don't up their act on dealing with the infodemic of fake news, then they'll find the regulators will start to move in on them. And there's nothing that such companies hate more than regulators taking an interest. But I think regulators will take an interest. We often look to the EU to lead and innovate in this area. But certainly in my own country.
Thanks, Helen. So we'll take the last questions before we end our today's webinar. Thanks, everyone. The last question is from Tanmoy Shorkar. How can the risk communication framework be modified on natural hazard in this pandemic situation? For example, suppose Bangladesh faces the same kind of disaster cyclone in this pandemic situation. What should be the potential risk communication framework, maintaining public health and other issues in terms of cyclone?
Yeah, I might just jump in, and perhaps Lisa would like to come in as well. I think it's been actually quite interesting. We saw that Cyclone Amphan hit India and Bangladesh, and they were able to adopt not just their risk communication, but their contingency planning to take into account the pandemic. They were able to evacuate tens of thousands of people, and mortality was actually relatively limited. But there were challenges because even though the cyclone didn't have the impact that was expected in India and Bangladesh, we did note that dozens of relief workers actually acquired COVID in the process of supporting communities to evacuate. So the messaging, needs to be both ways. It needs to be towards the community about the measures that they need to take to safely evacuate, but also towards the relief workers, the first responders, and perhaps that balance got a little bit off track. But everywhere in the region, there needs to be a review of the risk communication as well as the contingency planning and preparedness measures. This dual impact of climate change and pandemics is changing the game for certain countries. We see it in the Pacific as well, where we've had Cyclone Harold that had a tremendous impact economically on some of the countries there. And they've done a good job once again, but everything requires a second look, I'd say. We need to update our preparedness measures, and that includes our risk communication strategies.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. Today is the International Day of Disaster Risk Reduction, and today we all celebrate how people and communities around the world are reducing their exposure and disaster and raising awareness about the importance of running the risk they face. A recorded version will be sending all of you who have registered, and all the presentation will be available online as well. Feel free to provide your comments and questions. And on behalf of organizer, we thanks again for our speakers. We thanks our attendants to attending this webinar. Thanks all. Thank you so much.